Good evening all and welcome. Tonight marks our first video of 5 with 10 stories from the US. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Alabama. When I was in my early childhood, I had an adult neighbor who would watch me from his front yard. His name was Earl, and despite never playing golf, he often accidentally hit balls into our yard, watching me retrieve them. Earl gave off a strange vibe and made me feel weird, but a bunch of adult men made me uncomfortable, and I thought that was normal. Later in my preteens, he appeared outside our house, drunkenly rambling to my dead grandmother in the middle of the night. I had noticed one day that he had stopped coming outside. I stared at his house and felt this uneasy feeling. It almost made me sick. His yard was overgrown, but I guess he didn't have anyone who cared about him to check up on his well-being. Me being a curious, stupid kid, I decided to venture into Earl's home alone, just to see if he was okay. I pushed open the door with surprising ease, not expecting it to be unlocked. And the first thing to hit me was the overwhelming stench that permeated every part of my body. It was so foul, almost like a physical force I had to push through to make my way through the house, which was, unsurprisingly, a disaster. I called him by name and received no answer. I walked through what I could only assume amongst all the trash was supposed to be the kitchen. There was food that looked almost fresh on the table. I walked a little further into the bedroom, and this room smelled the worst. I'll never forget the smell, and I made the mistake of picking up the top mattress on Earl's double-bedded mattress. That's where I found his decomposing corpse, rotting in between the two mattresses. There was nothing to identify him, as his skin had melded with the mattress itself. That's when I heard something shuffling in the darkness. I got so scared I almost didn't run, but somehow my legs started running for me. Even now, I know that's the fastest I've ever run. It's the fastest I will ever have run. I didn't learn any details until later when I was talking to my sisters. The guy who ended Earl's life was squatting in the house. He had no motive for doing so, it was just convenient for him. The food I'd seen on the table was his. The killer was in the middle of eating when I went inside the house. He had ended Earl's life with a baseball bat and pressed him between the mattresses, and he had died the same night he came to our yard yelling at my dead grandmother. My discovery was about 2 weeks in an 109-degree heat summer. Alaska. I come from a small fishing village in Alaska. Our residents never surpassed 400 people living in the village at the time. Back in the 1930s, the village was relocated due to constant flooding. In our new village, we have homes, a school, 2 tribal offices, a boy and girls club, a post office, a church, and a graveyard. The graveyard sits atop a big hill down by the beach away from the rest of the village. Recently, we had to expand the graveyard because we were running out of plots, and this is relevant to what I'm going to say. You see, my village is haunted. Not just 1 or 2 of the houses or the school, the whole village. The spirits wandering have been seen walking up and down the roads, going into homes or buildings. Everyone in the small town has a story. Some hear babies crying in the woods, hear their dead relatives calling to them, even see dead relatives walk past them and vanish just as they catch up to them. Like everyone else in my village, I've had a few encounters that will stay with me, and I would like to share them with you. The following experience, though, happened when I was working as a maid for a hotel near the mall on the south side of Anchorage. While I was looking for the girl who was training me, I walked into the main room where the beds were. I turned back and started walking to the door to leave when I saw somebody, a whole person, walk past the bathroom door. I immediately stopped and thought maybe she just came in and started the bathroom. I peered inside the bathroom and didn't see her. I looked in the shower and no one was there. Leaving would have been impossible since there was only one door which I was blocking and the tub windows that open out as they were closed. I got spooked and left immediately since my fellow housekeepers told me that there was a spirit of a man who watched the mains clean, and if he didn't like you he would attack. He usually stayed on the 3rd floor, and that's the one I was on at the time. There was another time, back in my village, I remember seeing a huge metal thing hovering in the night sky. It had propellers like a helicopter, and I would have thought it was a helicopter, had it not been for the fact it was storming like hell that night. I'm talking about 40 to 50 feet waves crashing on the bankside, wind and rain that soaked my hoodie in minutes. I'm not sure what it was, but my friends and I were standing on the bank, looking at the inlet for the Loch Ness Monster, when this thing showed up and hovered above. It was close enough we couldn't see the whole thing, but far away that we couldn't touch it. We both screamed and ran back to the Boys and Girls Club where we told an adult, and we were informed it was probably just a weather balloon. All I remember is it was made of steel and hovering, and we never saw it again after that. There was another time when my brother and I decided to sleep in our older brother's room, which he kept pitch black. You couldn't see at all, there was no light. We slept in there watching a movie, and the TV turned off by itself after not being in use for a while. I woke up feeling my brother get up and walk out the bedroom to the bathroom, where I saw the light turn on and dim as he closed the door. My feet were blazing hot, so I did what you're never supposed to do. I hung them off the edge of the bed. As they were cooling, I thought that there were no such thing as bogeymen, and I laid there staring at nothing. I was waiting for my brother to come back so I could sleep in peace. That's when I felt at first a hand and then a fingernail scratch the sole of my foot very quickly. I hid under the covers and started begging to God or whoever was listening to make it go away. I waited maybe 30 more seconds before I poked my head out and then heard the toilet flush, and the door finally opened. I never told my brother since he was at that side of the bed, unknowingly protecting me from the thing. I was up against the wall and kept my limbs inside the blanket all night. Alaska 2. I never really intended on sharing this, as stickmen seem to be more specifically related by a select group of indigenous people of Alaska, which is where I'm from. However, it would appear that many others have had similar experiences, and I'm curious to see if any of you have. I was born into the Targetili tribe in central Alaska in the 1980s. This is about 50 miles south of Fairbanks, in a small town called Nenana. There are several other tribes in the immediate area, and long ago there were far more, before Russians and American settlements. It's also worth noting that paranormal experiences are a natural and expected part of my ancestral heritage. As a child, my grandparents and my father told strange tales of the stickmen, who were eaters of men. They especially loved the flesh of children, and newborn babies were considered delicacies by the spirits of the forest. One time when Nenana was first being settled by Gusok, or white people, there was a hunter who came from faraway lands to settle the wilderness of Alaska and to hunt its bears and moose. He took a small party of hunters and native guides into the forest, deep into the countrysides and to the marshes where moose and bears frequented. Far down the Tanana they went, shooting every animal they saw, be it squirrel, moose, wolf, porcupine. The natives were silent, and they led the men on, afraid to question their violent and wasteful ways. Until late one evening, the hunter called his party to set up camp and rest. They chose a quiet spot in a field where they could see all around them in case wolves decided to try and sneak up. And they rolled out their blankets after dinner and went to sleep, leaving some to take turns watching for animals. The hunter had fallen asleep quickly, content on his bed of furs and blankets. He had dreams of sunny days, perfect for hunting the famed grizzly. When he was awoken by the sound of cracking sticks, he found this odd, as they were in a field, but perhaps it was men rekindling a fire. Still, he peeked out of his tent flap to check on the encampment. There were pools of blood on the ground, but no corpses. He watched as a man bundled tightly in his blankets was lifted up by what appeared to be many small moving sticks and carried off towards the edge of camp. The man woke up from the gentle rocking of his convoy and screamed, alerting the remaining hunters in the camp, who jumped up and reached for their firearms. They were quick to draw, but confused by what to fire at, as mostly they just saw sticks on the ground, moving in ways that were impossible. They decided to run because there was nothing clearly to shoot at. But as they ran together, they were chased by giant animals that appeared suddenly from the tall grass. The hunter waited until the men were being chased by all the animals, then fled from his tent without looking back. He heard their screams and kept running. A week later, he showed up in Nenana, crazed, exhausted, and on the edge of death. He related his story and then perished, for he would constantly wake up screaming if he tried to sleep, and thus could not rest. A version of this story is common in my family, though some details change with the storyteller. My father claims to have seen the stickmen on hunting trips, and like this apocryphal hunter, he has been crazed and terrorized by the memory ever since. It is said that the stickmen go by different names and come to people in different shapes, and that there is some regularity to their appearances. They generally come as either sticks which blend in with the trees or the ground until you come upon them, or they can visit you as an animal. This animal is usually described as either a large deer or a small moose, which can move incredibly quickly for how awkward it seems to be hunched on its legs. They appear as pale or white animals, and though they usually do this to intimidate men and women, they are hungry beings who feast on the unwary. Seeing a stick man, one may be haunted for years or their entire life, but in some cases it can be considered good luck, as if a stick man is uninterested in you, it means you have powerful ancestors surrounding you. You can usually anticipate the arrival of a stick man, as the entire forest will go quiet around you for as long as they are in the vicinity, and sometimes they will speak with you or to each other. When this happens, it sounds like a raspy whisper mixed with the rattle of a dry willow branch. Do not camp where the forest is silent, and do not look into the eyes of stickmen, for they will drive you mad with fear. I have never seen these spirits personally, at least I can't be sure. My only experience with one potentially happened outside of Carson City, Nevada. I was driving alone in a big Ford pickup late at night, when I noticed what originally I took to be a deer on the side of the road. This was no deer. It ran like a dog or cat, staying close to the ground in a liquid motion, whereas deer would bounce or gallop as they run away. It also was moving faster than 30 miles an hour, and when it turned and ran down the hill, I realized it was much larger than almost any deer I'd ever seen and lacked antlers. If anyone has any questions or their own experiences, I'd love to hear about it. Arizona. I'm a female for reference, and this happened to me on my 13th birthday. My sister, my cousin and I decided for my birthday we wanted to camp outside alone. My sister was 5 years older, so technically she was an adult but had not yet turned 18. My cousin was 15, and as I said, I was turning 13. My parents were worried about us going out too far due to the wild animals and people that now seem to live in state parks, and my parents decided that we would camp out on their friend's property since he owned 25 acres of land. We set up our tents and even built a campfire. All of us had been camping all of our lives, so we felt very comfortable in the woods. After we ate some beanie weenies that we heated up over the campfire, we laughed and joked and told a few scary stories before we all decided we were getting tired. We got into the tent after we put out our fire and laid down to scary stories we were telling each other. I think my sister fell asleep first, then my cousin. and we were all starting to fall asleep when I heard some leaves crunching. I didn't want to make noise by waking up my sister and cousin, so I sat there listening for a while. The footsteps seemed to stop, and I started to fall asleep again. Just as I was falling back asleep, I heard the footprints again and saw a shadow outside our tent. My feet were closest to the tent zipper, and I coiled them up out of fear. As I did that, a black glove hand came through the tent and began to unzip the zipper. I was gripped with fear and had no idea what to do. We didn't have any weapons except for a small knife, and at this point I have no idea where it even was. I was sweating, and as the hand slowly unzipped the tent, the other hand grabbed my feet. At this point I couldn't hold my terror and screamed as loudly as I could. My sister and cousin immediately woke up, looked over, and saw the hand on the tent and the other hand at my feet and began screaming as well. She stepped on the hand with her foot, and they made a grunt and ran off. We sat there for a few minutes not knowing what to do since we were not in our backyard. We were on my dad's friend's property. We opened the tent and took off towards the house. We ran so fast, crying, and began banging on the door. My dad's friend was there. He opened the door and told us since it was past midnight, we should just sleep in the basement, which was finished off and had a huge sofa with a bulkhead door that led outside. It took us forever to relax and try and fall asleep. We all slept close together until about 3 a.m. when a knock came to the bulkhead door. My sister thought it might be the owner, so she moved the curtain back before opening the door, and there was a person with a scream mask standing by it. When he saw her, he started to bang loudly on the door, and we felt like he was trying to break it down. My cousin ran upstairs and woke up the owner, who called the cops. We called my parents at the time, who came to get us, and they arrived shortly after the police. They looked around his property and found a campsite on the land where it was apparent someone had been staying, but they didn't find the person. Since then, I will not camp outside alone or without a weapon, and I encourage everyone to stay safe since the scariest thing in the woods, I feel, is other people. Arkansas. My experience took place in Independence County in the mid to late 90s when I was around 10 years old and in the 3rd grade. I actually still remember our exact address to this house despite being very young. We lived in this house for only a few years due to the crazy things we experienced. I was the youngest of 3 children and shared a bunk bed with my older brother, while my sister had her own room on the opposite side of the house. My parents had a tumultuous and toxic marriage, with my stepdad being an abusive alcoholic. The house had beautiful all-wood floors, so it started off relatively small. But my brother and I always heard talking late in the night while we were sleeping. There was no bedroom that shared walls with another bedroom, and these voices were clearly heard and not muffled from another room. We also didn't have another house bordering ours close enough to hear speaking. At first, we all kind of chalked it up to people walking outside or the TV. We didn't have TVs in our bedrooms back then or anything else, which is why Christmas was great, because we got Walkmans. I would wear them at night to try and drown out the talking, and sometimes it helped. The conversations never made sense to us. We could hear them clearly, but we couldn't always make out what they were saying, and they would move from room to room. I've forgotten most of that in comparison to the other memories. It was creepy, but the conversations were never threatening or violent or anything like that, so it was easy to write off. Around this time, we also got a phone gifted to us from my grandmother, as at the time she worked in a funeral home doing makeup for the deceased. The phone actually came from the funeral home, either from their home phones or something they received from one of the deceased. So we were never sure if the phone was messed up by something attached before our home or something from our house. But every night at 10:15 exactly, the phone would ring, sometimes a half ring, other times a full ring, and these were not programmable phones. They were old phones that had normal buttons and no display, So we called the phone company to see who was calling, but they said there wasn't any record of any call coming in at that time. We were transferred a bunch to try and figure it out, but they all came out completely useless. There was no alarm or alarm set to ring, and zero trace of anything coming up. We'd turn the ringer down. It didn't matter, it would still ring. We'd unplug the phone, and it would still ring. One night specifically, my dad got angry. He ripped the front off the cradle of the phone and ripped the wires out, proudly stating, "Now, bet we get a full night's sleep." He laid down very satisfied with himself, only to be jarred awake at exactly 10:15 by its ringing. My brother and I heard it and went running in there, shocked to see the phone perfectly intact with not a wire out of place. But the next morning, it was just as torn apart as when my stepdad had handled it. Was it a shared dream? I'll never know. But it wasn't before long after that the phone went to the dump and we got a replacement one, and there was never an issue with the new one, which led us to a conclusion that whatever was wrong with it came from where it was previously. We'd been having other smaller incidents all during this time, like hearing voices, footsteps, giggling, doors closing, shadows, but probably one of the more serious was one evening when all 5 of us were in the living room watching TV. Again, it's the 90s, so we only shared one TV. We were probably watching America's Funniest Videos or Unsolved Mysteries, and my stepdad got angry about something minor. He began yelling and shouting at us, then he got up off the couch, stormed off into and down the hallway and to his bedroom. The 4 of us were all still sitting in the living room, but now more subdued and not making a sound. So all 4 of us pretty much jumped out of our skin with fright when we hear my stepdad squeal, which is a sound we'd never heard from him, and then he shouts several expletives along with some very loud crashes and thuds. Then this grown man comes barreling out of his bedroom, down the hall and looking at us accusingly. But the man was as pale as a ghost and trembling, literally trembling. Again, I must stress, it's something we had never seen him do our entire lives. He worked road construction and was very tan, very fit and strong, so the sight put the fear of God in us. He was shaking so hard he could barely get words out or point a finger. But he demanded to know which one of us went in there, grabbed him, and then shoved him hard into the wall. We were all staring, mouths open, too stunned to speak. We just kind of shook our heads, which made him repeat the demand, telling us we'd better tell him now or he'd whoop our asses. So we all said that none of us did it. We were right there, none of us had moved a muscle. Then my sister, who was the only one really allowed to talk back to him without repercussion, jumped in. She explained that none of us had moved, and that furthermore, it would have been impossible for us to have gotten up and followed him down the hall into the bedroom and touched him, then turned around, make it back to the living room before him, and that even if we could have done it, there was no way he wouldn't have seen us at some point. So, he let it go. But he explained that once he made it into the room, something grabbed him by the shoulder and then shoved him hard into the wall, causing him to stumble over and fall to the ground. Then he got up and was trying to run out, and something he couldn't see tripped him. So that was definitely terrifying. The next and last big event happened one morning during breakfast. All 5 of us were in the kitchen at the table eating pancakes and bacon. My brother and I were arguing over who got the syrup first, and we were ordered to knock it off. So we engaged in silently shooting ugly looks at each other, which in turn distracted me while pouring the syrup. I got too much and spilled some off the side of my plate. This infuriated my stepdad, who began screaming and cussing at me, telling me to watch what I was doing and say something about me being an idiot. Obviously, he said it a lot. He kept ranting and raising his voice at me, and I struggled not to start crying, and my mum was trying to wipe it up. Then we heard all these loud crashes and the sound of shattering glass from the living room, so we all jumped up and ran in there. Now this is a very large living room because it had technically been 2 rooms together, one half being the dining room and the other the living room. My mum had these 3 glasses shelved, stacked one directly over the other on the wall. So they were stacked like a bookshelf, but they weren't attached. They were affixed to the wall with a brass bracket and screws. Now each of these shelves was full of all these glass knickknacks and figurines that my mum had bought and painted herself. As we watched with our own eyes, every single figure that was on the middle shelf was thrown from that shelf clear across the room, hitting the opposite wall and shattering to pieces at the base of it. I cannot stress how far apart these walls were, but they were far away. There was simply no way they would have shattered that hard against the wall unless they were thrown by a very strong force. But there was no one there, and we witnessed it. When it was all said and done, everything that had been on the middle shelf now lay at the base of the opposite wall. The shelf itself hung perfectly straight, as it had been, like nothing had happened or touched it. It wasn't moving, leaning, tilted, or anything, and anything on the top or bottom remained totally untouched. We were too stunned to speak. We had started to notice a sort of pattern at the very end. Stuff seemed to really happen when my stepdad lost his temper and began to yell at us kids. But we found a new place to live before long and basically took a vow of silence. It was kind of an unspoken truce that we would never speak of these incidents again. We were in a very religious family, and it was completely forbidden to speak about such things as they were the work of the devil or witchcraft. It took years and years until we spoke of it, and by the time we were all adults. But we were told something interesting by the people who owned the house when we moved, and it weirdly made sense in a way. They told us that long ago, the land our house was built on, basically the whole block of the neighborhood, was a children's home. It was like an orphanage, but one day a fire broke out and pretty much burnt it to the ground. They said some of the children and a couple of the adults never made it out of there and perished in the fire. So to us it made sense now why all these things happened directly after my stepdad began being a jerk. I don't know whether it was the adults or the children or both, who took offense to the mistreatment of kids. This is a fact we'll never know. California. I was a 16-year-old girl, the oldest of 7 siblings who are technically my half-siblings split between my mum and dad. At this time I was living with my dad, my stepmom Marge, and their 1-year-old son Evan. We had just moved into a bigger house because of Evan being born, and we were still unpacking. The atmosphere at home was tense because my dad and Marge were attending marriage counseling due to his affair. The decision to buy a house during this time only added to the confusion and discomfort. They had these sessions for 2 days a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and they would be gone for about an hour to an hour and a half at most. I was left home alone to watch Evan, which I didn't mind because it wasn't that long and I loved spending time with him. I remember we were in the living room watching a movie he loved. I can't remember what it was now, but it was nice to be watching TV and playing with him. It must have been around 4 p.m. on a Thursday. Then I was making him a snack when I heard this loud thump from our garage. I thought maybe our parents were home early, but I would have heard the garage door open. Now, I was and still am a pretty paranoid person and believe in the paranormal. So my first thought was, great, this house is haunted. I just ignored it, not wanting to give it attention, and was more focused on Evan. I gave him his snacks, and I went to sit on the couch. He was just playing with his toys and watching TV, so I decided to use this chance to go to the bathroom really quick. Now the house had 2 bathrooms, but one had something wrong with the toilet, so I had to use my parents' bathroom that was attached to their bedroom. I walked into their room and was just reaching the bathroom trying to be quick so I wouldn't leave Evan alone for too long. Then I heard the door that led to the garage open up, which was attached to a small laundry room, and I immediately turned around and rushed back, thinking Evan had somehow gotten into the garage. I ran out to look in the garage for him, but he wasn't in there at all. Confused and now completely scared, I was running back into the house when I saw Evan giggling and running past the laundry room/garage door. Feeling relieved that he was fine, I playfully ran after him. He ended up running to our parents' room, and I grabbed him using a jokey, stern voice and told him, "You scared me." That's when I looked up from the open bedroom doors and felt like I was going to be sick. Right there, in the hallway, peeking around the corner was this disgusting-looking man. His skin was oily and dirty, his hair this nasty brown that was slicked down onto his head with grease, and he had this gross, sickening smile on his face. He was looking at Evan specifically, with this look on his face that I can only describe as predatory, like he'd just caught fresh kill. I felt like I was going to faint, holding Evan tighter and starting to slowly back away. And that was when he ran towards us, and I just turned around and ran back into the bathroom. I couldn't close the bedroom doors in time. He was way too close to them for me to do it in time, so all I thought to do was to run into their large walk-in closet at the end of the bathroom. When I did, I slammed and locked it, thank God it had locks, and started to cry. I didn't know what to do, and at this point Evan had begun to cry because I was crying, and the man was screaming to unlock the door. I just pulled Evan close, and as far from the door as I could, putting my back to the door and shielding him. He continued to bang on the door, saying disgusting things about Evan like, "I just wanted to have fun with a little cutie, give me the boy and I won't hurt you. I promise I won't end him." And worse than I honestly don't want to repeat. I sat there, screaming and crying for help as I held my little brother. I felt so stupid for leaving my phone out in the living room and felt so useless, unable to do a damn thing to protect him. I was scared that the man would break down the door and take him away forever, and that we would never see him alive again. Suddenly the bangs and screaming stopped, and I stopped screaming for a minute. Then I heard him say something that has never left my mind since. "I'll leave him alone, if I can have you instead." I actually got so scared that I pissed myself. I just sat there, frozen in fear in a pool of my own pee, as what he said was ringing in my ears. But I knew either it was me or Evan, and I looked down at his crying face. He was so scared that he couldn't open his eyes and was shaking. I then gave his head a kiss, hugged him for what I thought would be the last time, and said, "Okay, please just don't hurt my brother. You can have me, I won't fight or scream. Just promise you won't hurt him." I could hear him laughing behind the door, and that scared me more. I felt so vulnerable, knowing I had no escape, but it was either me or Evan, and I'd rather it be me. I thought I had lived long enough to say I had a good life, but Evan was only one. He'd barely started. Then I heard the man say, "I swear." I then hid Evan behind some clothes, told him to stay there until his mummy got home, and unlocked the door. I was so scared, but I didn't care what happened to me at that moment, so long as my baby brother would be unharmed and would live. I kept myself between the man and the door, but surprisingly, he did keep his word and just grabbed my arm, forcing me out of the bedroom to the garage door. I then heard police sirens coming up the street, and at that moment he let me go and ran out for the side of our house, where there was a door I didn't even know about. It led into the backyard, and apparently it was unlocked, and that's how he got inside. I then ran back into Evan, scooped him up in my arms and ran through the front door. About 3 cops were outside, and I think one sped off to go after the man. I didn't care. All I cared about was that Evan was safe. I ended up carrying him into the back of a cop car and crying, trying to say what happened and begging to help me call my dad. A nice officer ended up calling Marge and explained what happened. They both rushed home and practically snatched Evan away from me, who was still clinging to me and crying. They were so grateful he was okay. It turns out a neighbor saw the man lurking around our house and called the cops because they knew a family had just moved in. I explained all I could to the officers, who were really sweet and helped me calm down, and explained to my parents everything that had happened. My parents were of course scared and worried about us, but furious at me for leaving Evan alone in the living room. Marge was especially angry with me that I peed in their closet, and after the cops left I had to clean it up and out of the carpet. I honestly didn't care. All I cared about was that Evan and I were safe, and that hopefully that disgusting pervert would be caught. The next day after I got home from school, I found out the man was indeed caught, and it turns out he was a sex offender, having assaulted multiple boys before. It made me sick to know he had targeted my little brother. How he targeted him specifically, though, I wasn't too sure about, but that's all I remember detail-wise. I was just so grateful for that neighbor. If they didn't see that man, who knows what would have happened. This event sadly made my paranoia worse, and it really affected my life. I can never truly feel comfortable unless I relock any doors multiple times and still have nightmares about it from time to time. I can't even sleep unless I lock my bedroom door and have a metal bat underneath my pillow despite being 24. Evan, thankfully, doesn't seem to remember it, and now he's a happy kid. I haven't really seen him in years due to a bad fallout with my dad and stepmom, but I'll never forget that day. I wouldn't change what I did, and I still would give myself up to keep any of my siblings safe. Colorado. It was the end of my first year of grad school at the University of Iowa, and summer was well underway. The cicadas and mourning doves perched in the oak trees next to our small ranch house. They were already singing their summer song, and the days were warm and muggy. Iowa City was a pleasant and friendly place, but once the students left for the summer, to me it felt like a bit of a cultural desert in a very flat land of cornfield and small towns. Ready for a break and hungry for a change of scenery, my husband and I began to consider a road trip that might fit to our meager grad student budget. Some friends of ours had recently moved to LA and had been asking us to come visit, but we certainly couldn't afford plane tickets or even a night's stay in a hotel, and because I had some summer classes, I only had 2 weeks to make the trip. So our options were to either drive straight through, take turns sleeping and driving, or to take the scenic route and camp along the way. We decided a little of both. Now this was in the early 1980s, so there was neither internet nor GPS to map the way. Instead, our trusty guide was a dog-eared Randall McNulty Atlas of the US, gifted to my parents by an insurance company and bequeathed to me after they received a new one. Looking back, I should probably have spent the money on one that was more up-to-date, but hey, it was free. As I studied the atlas and possible routes, I noticed that the most direct way would take us through Colorado and the Rocky Mountains. It was then I recalled one of my happiest childhood memories, a camping trip I took with my family to the Rocky Mountains National Park in the summer I was 9 years old. Our first night, which was my very first experience camping, was in a lovely little campground just outside of the park. We found a quiet, secluded spot and pitched our tent near a clear mountain stream that sang us to sleep. In all the subsequent years my family went camping, we never found as idyllic a spot as that one, and I had always wanted to return. My husband and I sat down at the kitchen table with the old atlas to plan our trip. Plotting a course on Interstate 80 from Iowa City would take us through the Rockies on our way to Los Angeles. We would camp the first night in Nebraska and spend the second night recreating my childhood memories in the campground outside the Rocky Mountain National Park. Then, we would visit the park the next day and drive straight through the rest of the way to LA. My husband had never been camping, but thought it might be fun, so he was game. And I was excited to show him the natural beauty of the park and the campsite. However, the only camping equipment that we owned was a Coleman camp stove and a tiny orange 2-person pup tent. Across the street from our house lived a couple who could have been poster children for REI. She was an anthropologist and he was a resident at the medical school. They spent all their free time in the great outdoors and had just about every piece of gear you could imagine for an outdoor adventure. I knew they would have everything we needed. They were more than happy to provide us with sleeping bags and a few other essentials as well as advice. They pointed out that in early June there could be snow in the Rockies, so it was a good idea to take a mummy sleeping bag. Sitting there talking in the typical Midwest summer 90-degree heat, 90% humidity of their backyard, I could hardly imagine why we would need them. But later, I was very glad we accepted their offer. On the day of our departure, we left before dawn. Our tiny Chevy hatchback packed so full of camping equipment, a big cooler of food and clothes, that we felt a bit like two anchovies packed into a four-wheeled can. We spent the first night at a campground next to the interstate and a man-made pond in Nebraska. The noise of the nearby interstate and drunks playing loud music in the RV park next to us did not make for very restful sleep, but we knew the next night we would be in paradise, so we did our best to rest and get as much shut-eye as we could. The next morning, after a quick breakfast of cereal and milk at the picnic table by our tent, we packed up and headed west, leaving our hungover neighbors to sleep it off in their RV. The drive was pleasant and the weather warm and sunny. By late afternoon, we arrived at the location of the campground, except it wasn't there. Although marked on the atlas, there were no campgrounds, no signs, nothing but a meadow at that location. We drove around, taking several side roads, but eventually I had to admit defeat. The campground was long gone, and my atlas was outdated. I could see on the map that there were several campgrounds within the park, so we decided to continue and look for a campground near the Fall River Visitors Center. As we came nearer the park and higher in elevation, the pine needle carpet of the forest began to disappear under a blanket of snow. The road was clear, but the higher we went, the deeper the snow was by the side of the road. I was starting to get a bad feeling. Sure enough, when we reached the visitor center and campground, we were greeted by a closed sign. Our hearts sank. It was going to be dark before long, and we were not sure we could find a place to pitch our tent. However, the sign indicated that the campground near the west entrance to the park was open. Not a fan of driving on curvy mountain roads in the twilight, I switched seats with my husband and let him drive up the mountains and across the Continental Divide to reach the west side of the park. The sun was starting to dip below the top of the pine forest when we found, with great relief, the west campground entrance. The gate was open, and we drove into the campground, stopping at the nearest site. My husband looked with dismay at the snow-covered field in front of us. I don't know about you, but sleeping on a foot of snow in below freezing weather might not be a good idea. Oh, come on, I answered, trying to be cheerful. Where's your sense of adventure? After all, our sleeping bags are good to 15 below zero. The truth is, I wasn't feeling all too good about this either. Along with my failure to anticipate that summer arrives later in the Rockies than in Iowa, there was something positively creepy about the deserted campground. I took a quick walk around but saw no one else, and no tire tracks to indicate that anyone else had been here recently, other than the open gate and the open latrine. There were no other signs that it was ready for the upcoming camping season, and despite it being deserted, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. We quickly set up our little pup tent and built a fire inside the designated ring of rocks. I was glad that I had thought ahead and brought our own firewood, as any branches or logs that might have been in the area were buried under the snow. We grabbed our cooler out of the car and opened the packet of hot dogs and some buns, roasting our meal over the open flame. It was too cold to stay out for long, as it was now dark and getting colder. So much for s'mores, I thought. And while my husband took the sleeping bags from the car and unrolled them in the tent, I put the fire out. Many years as a Girl Scout, and later a Girl Scout counselor, had made me a bit of a stickler when it came to putting out a campfire. First, I put water on it, then spread the coals, then put more water on them, spread them some more, and then put snow on top, stamping it with my snow boot. There was a final hiss and it all went dark. Smokey the Bear would have been proud. I crawled into my little tent, zipping it shut beside me, and snuggled into the sleeping bag beside my husband. I pulled up the zipper until the only part of me exposed in the mummy bag was a circle around my face, and I drifted off to sleep, warm despite the bed of snow beneath me. I silently thanked my neighbors for insisting we take the down bags. It was well beyond midnight when something made me sit bolt upright. It was so dark I couldn't even see the door of the tent or my hand, and I held my breath, listening for a moment. But the only sound was the wind in the surrounding pines. I laid back, closed my eyes, wanting to sleep, yet there was a feeling of dread. My eyes couldn't have been shut for more than 2 minutes, when suddenly I heard a crackling sound. I opened my eyes and saw that the tent was bathed in an orange glow. I turned my head, and through the orange nylon fabric, I saw a ring of what appeared to be dancing flames surrounding by the tent. I'd barely had time to register my astonishment or process what I was seeing, when above me, I heard a demonic laugh, and then the tent disappeared. I know it sounds crazy, but it simply evaporated, leaving me and my sleeping husband exposed to the elements. Terrified, I sat up and looked above me to see this source of the bone-chilling laughter. There was a very tall fir tree next to our tent, and on a branch about 10 feet up, a crouched man. And on a branch about 10 feet up the trunk, crouched a man. Well, not exactly a man. He was dressed as a priest with a black suit and white clerical collar, but he had horns and hooves and the face of a demon, and his eyes locked with ours. He sprung off the branch, hurtling towards me and cackling. "I saw what you did and you're going to hell." I screamed the loudest scream I've ever screamed in my life, and the next thing I know, my husband was yelling, "What the hell?" and shaking me awake. He unzipped my sleeping bag and helped me sit up. "Are you all right?" he asked with concern. I was not okay. My heart was beating so hard I thought I was going to have a heart attack, and I was trembling like a mouse who had just come face to face with a cat. But there I was, in the tent, in my sleeping bag and no demon. I guess I had a nightmare. I told him what I'd seen or dreamed of, but it didn't seem like a dream at all, it seemed real. My husband was a fairly open-minded person, but he also was an engineer and, like most engineers, was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or possessing much of an imagination, and paranormal occurrences were, in his mind, easily explained away. So he patted my back patronizingly and said no, it was just a bad dream. Go back to. But before he could finish his sentence, we both became aware of a glowing light and crackling sound in front of our tent. Cautiously, he unzipped the door and peered out. There in the darkness was our campfire, the one I had so meticulously put out and covered with snow before we went to bed, blazing brightly. It was still several hours until sunrise, and without a word he went outside, kicked snow over the fire, and shoveled some dirt on top. We didn't bother rolling up the bags or putting the tents into its cover. We just threw everything into the car, jumped in and drove away as fast as we could. I never could get him to go camping after that, and although I have camped many times since, it has never been on that side of the Rockies.